Hey everyone, Chris here. Thanks for checking out the podcast. If you're enjoying it and learning something along with us, please consider becoming a supporting patron at patreon.com/ateachershistory. Or you could leave a rating and review on iTunes. It would be a huge help. If you'd like to raise your hand and participate along with us, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, @ateachershistory, or shoot me an email, chris@ateachershistory.com. All right, let's get on to the next episode. But before we do that, just a real quick audio programming note. Due to some computer issues, last week's episode, as you could probably tell, my audio was very echoey. And in this week's episode, my computer just shut down right in the middle of recording. So Zach and I had to come back up, and I had to jump right back in. And when I jumped back in, my audio was a little bit off again. Usually these are things that I would just re-record the whole thing again for you for your audio experience, but because I had Zach on with me, I was unable to do that this week and last week. I got a new computer now, upgraded the equipment. This should not be an issue in the future. Thanks for your patience and understanding. All right, now let's get into the episode. Hello, class. Welcome to A Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining us again today. Did you know that in the Southern Theater of the American Revolution, Andrew Jackson, a young 14-year-old Andrew Jackson, was injured, which began his long-standing enmity toward the British? That the Americans won a pretty significant battle at Kings Mountain without any overall commander and using just militia, and that Nathaniel Greene broke basically all the laws of military strategy and split his men in the Southern Theater after he took over as commander of the Southern Army, leading to renewed American momentum. Did you know all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out, because today we will cover that and more in episode 68, The War Turned South, Part 2. Hello, everyone. Welcome into class and welcome into episode 68. I am lucky enough to be joined once again by my fellow history nerd, Zach Woods. Zach, welcome back to the podcast for the second week in a row.
Pleasure to be here, Chris. Glad I could come back for part 2.
Yeah, and you just finished up with like a 10-mile or a 10-hour drive, correct?
Yes,
you just got back from vacation?
Yeah, I was out in the western part of Texas, hiking the Guadalupe Mountain, traveled over to New Mexico, saw the White Sands National Monument,
wow,
and went to the birthplace of bouldering called Waco Tanks.
Sounds pretty exciting, you and your outdoorsy stuff.
Yes,
yeah.
It was. My butt is tired from sitting in the car for now 12 hours. But I'm excited to talk about this.
Good. Well, thanks for joining me again today, and I'm glad traffic didn't hold you up too much. A couple housekeeping things. Shout out to some new patrons: Tim, Chris, Justin, Norm, Lanae, and Mary. Thank you so much for signing up to Patreon to support the show. Chris actually, and no, it's not me. I didn't email myself, but newest patron Chris actually emailed me and said, thanks so much for putting up the Patreon bonus episode on Benedict Arnold. It was a pleasant surprise and an extremely informative episode. I have always hated Benedict Arnold, and now I actually know why. I've been meaning to sign up for weeks, and this episode was a pleasant reminder of why I should. I'm going on Patreon to sign up now. Looking forward to more bonus episodes in the future. God bless America, and screw Benedict Arnold. P.S. Where is Bill? I miss him. Well, Chris, I'm glad that you enjoyed the episode. Bill will be back soon. Bill and I are actually doing a extra credit Patreon episode on an examination of the movie The Patriot. That should be coming up in the next week or two. So if you are a patron or plan on signing up on Patreon and want to check out that episode, I recommend you rent the movie The Patriot. Watch it all over again, and then you can sort of debrief it with us. And then Zach, Bill, and I will be hopping on for Q&A in the next week or two also. So if you have questions about the American Revolution or about anything we've talked about up to this point in American history or plan on talking about in the future, shoot me a tweet at A Teacher's Hist, an email chris@ateachershistory.com, or go on the website to send us a question for the Q&A episode coming up. 2 book recommendations for this week. Number 1, The Devil of a Whipping, The Battle of Cowpens by Lawrence Babbitts. And the one that I probably prefer out of the 2, I really like this book, The Road to Guilford Courthouse, The American Revolution in the Carolinas. And that is by John Buchanan. I am actually going to be updating the website soon. I'm going to be putting up all of the book recommendations that I've mentioned on the past 5 or 10 podcasts, and then I'm going to go back and list all the books I would recommend for the other stuff that we've talked about up to this point in American history also. So I'll let you know when that's officially updated on the website. And all right, let's get on with it. So welcome to class. To catch everyone up, I want to briefly provide context for our lesson today. So last week we spoke about part 1 of the Southern Theater, and for the most part discussed a lot of British victory. The sieges of Savannah and Charleston were huge successes for the British, and the Battle of Camden was, of course, an overwhelming victory. One of the almost immediate frustrations that Cornwallis had, though, was that the victory at Camden did not halt the Patriot momentum as much as he had hoped. And some historians believe that other historians sort of over-exaggerate the importance of the Battle of Camden. The guerrilla tactics of the American militias, led by men such as Francis Marion, Thomas Sumter, and Andrew Pickens, still made it challenging to effectively recruit loyalists in South Carolina, while at the same time making it almost impossible for the British to maintain any significant presence in South Carolina, which, of course, in turn, made it much more difficult for them to continue to move north, which was, in the end, the major purpose of the Southern strategy. Today we'll be discussing what we have labeled as part 2 of this venture into the South, and we will see that American forces begin to turn things around slowly but surely and recapture the momentum from the British, leading to our episode next week on the Battle of Yorktown and the end of the fighting in the American Revolution. Zach, anything else you wanted to add before we dove into our first conflict in part 2 of the war turning south?
Yeah, Chris, there's actually a few things we should talk about. So post the Battle of Camden, right, Cornwallis should be victorious. Hey, Savannah and Charleston have been captured. I just defeated the major Continental Army detachment in the South. This theater should be complete. I should be done. Let me go ahead and move north. Yet he's perplexed with the difficulty in subjugating the population. So post the capture of Charleston, Clinton had basically ordered everyone to take an oath of allegiance to the crown, and Cornwallis is getting frustrated that it's being broken. So essentially there was cases of loyalist militias switching sides. An entire regiment actually absconded while escorting wounded troops. So with this frustration, Cornwallis orders that anyone caught breaking their oath should be imprisoned and their property seized. And militia that switched sides should be hung. So this is actually has the opposite effect, right? It causes folks to be even more embittered towards the crown. And Cornwallis also empowers a young cadre of officers. These officers are basically favor more aggressive tactics in subduing the population. So this is men like Bannister Tarleton, who we've already talked about, but also Nisbet Balfour, Francis Rowden. Additionally, the British are also going to further alienate the backcountry population in the South. These are what we would call Scotch-Irish. So they're basically a Gaelic people from either Scotland or Ireland, and they were referred to as the over-the-mountain men. And they were alienated because they were Presbyterians. And the British officers, were Anglicans, did not think much of these Presbyterians. So Major James Wimes actually burns a Presbyterian church, calling it a sedition shop. Quote, a sedition shop, I should say. So these over-the-mountain men are also basically being marginalized, and it basically inflames their passion, which we'll see later.
And just to point out real quick for the listener, just keep in mind when we talk about in just a few minutes the Battle of Kings Mountain, the American militia are going to be, much of them are going to be these over the mountain men who fight the British there.
Exactly. So the Patriot partisan leaders like Thomas Sumter, who had the great nickname the Carolina Gamecock, really a superb nickname.
Not as good as the Swamp Fox.
Yeah, not as good as the Swamp Fox, but still pretty good.
Yeah.
We're motivated by actually some of these actions by these young British officers who were trying to be aggressive. So Thomas Sumter's house was actually burnt by the Loyalist cavalry detachment under Tarleton, the British Legion.
And that actually reminds me, real quick, sorry, Zach, I keep interrupting, but that reminds me of the scene from a movie, The Patriot. Right? Yeah, very good. You can see where they get it from.
Yeah. So once you guys get to that episode, you'll see that there's these little tidbits that they pull that actually come from, the real history.
Yes.
So in this backdrop of the war in the South, a young Andrew Jackson, at the age of 14, basically loses most of his relatives. And he's actually captured by the British and is scarred by a British officer when he refuses to shine said officer's boots. So the essence of the war in the South basically enters this new phase, one of tit-for-tat killings. This is basically the Loyalists have been empowered by the British. They're going out being very aggressive against Patriots who they felt were unfair to them in the previous years. The Patriots respond with their own tit-for-tat killings and raids, and it creates a cycle of violence that constantly escalates. So Cornwallis, faced with this partisan conflict that is basically causing him to spread his forces out to protect supply lines and loyalists, is, stuck with an interesting choice. Does he defend? Does he try to concentrate his forces for some thrust in some strategic direction? What does he do? Well, he decides to leave the Carolinas and to strike north. And the basic, the logic behind this is the Patriot partisans and the remnant of the Southern Army, which now was under the command of Nathaniel Greene, were unwilling to give battle in the open. So Cornwallis basically believed if he could strike north, he could basically erode the Patriots' supply base and cut off their ability to make any war at all. And it's important to remember that there's no gun factories or powder munition dumps or stores or anything like this in the South. So basically, they're totally dependent upon those supplies, basically coming from the French or the Spanish into New England or Virginia and then percolating their way down. So for a while, this march to the north works, right? Detachments of loyalists are raised, slaves join the British on the promise of freedom. Some of them are pulled into the ranks. And then there's this everlasting hope that the Creek and Cherokee Indians to the west will actually support the war. But this is all going to change with two critical battles.
Yeah, it absolutely, and we'll actually be covering three battles today, but two of them being the major battles that you alluded to, Zach, and we will circle back to a couple of these larger points that you talked about through our discussion today. So let's hop right into it, right? Let's not spend any more time laying backdrop, but let's get into the action. And when we left off last week, Bannister Tarleton had defeated the American forces at the Battle of Waxhaw, reportedly not giving any of the surrendering soldiers any proper quarter and enraging Americans in the process. I do want to add a caveat that I didn't mention last week, and that I may have mentioned it briefly, but even if I did, I think it's important to bring it up again. It is not proven that Bannister Tarleton ordered the massacre of all of the surrendering Americans. In fact, some reports are, and fairly reliable ones, that the Americans were trying to surrender, and during this entire surrendering situation, someone shot at Bannister Tarleton and shot his horse out from under him, and his horse then collapsed on his leg, and he was stuck underneath his horse, and his men, becoming furious at what they believed to be a very underhanded thing, shooting shooting at their officer, number one, and two, while on the ruse, during the ruse of surrendering, they became enraged and they started killing these Americans so as not to fall for any of their tricks again. And some even report that when Bannister Tarleton was able to get up and gather his bearings, he actually called for his men to stop. So, we're all huge fans of America here, and the Swamp Fox and the Gamecock. But I do want to give at least Bannister Tarleton the benefit of the doubt there for the battles of Waxhaw. But either way, it was a propagandized, quote-unquote, massacre. And because of that, and just the desire to fight British occupation in general, the recruitment of militia forces, especially in these backcountry areas with the over-the-mountain men, like you mentioned, Zach, began to rise significantly for the Americans. Arriving in North Carolina in September of 1780, British Major Patrick Ferguson was tasked with protecting the flank of Lord Cornwallis's main army, which at that time was heading towards Charlotte, North Carolina. He was tasked specifically with recruiting loyalist militias who would take up arms in name of the king, and that was easier said than done. Because as Ferguson was working to raise his militia, American patriot colonels, many of these being these mountain men, men named Isaac Shelby, James Williams, and Elijah Clark, were trying to make life as difficult as possible on Ferguson. After an American raid at Musgrove's Mill that saw 63 Tories die and 70 taken prisoner, compared to only 16 casualties on the American side, these American militiamen all of a sudden got Ferguson's attention. And he recognized that he was going to go out and crush them. And this sort of goes back to the oath that you were talking about, Zach, because Ferguson basically went out and warned everyone, like, hey, if you join the militia with these men, I'm going to kill all of you, and it's just a matter of time. And this is the incendiary language that the British constantly used to try to suppress a revolt, but we both know that the harder you fight the source of the revolt, the more energized it becomes. So this small victory not only heartened the Patriots on the heels of this disaster at Camden, but was also a reminder to the British of just how challenging it was going to be to subdue the South Carolina backcountry, because this was one of dozens and dozens of small raids and skirmishes that amounted in a few, dozen people dead on either side. After word of Musgrove's Mill and the subsequent chase by Ferguson, militiamen all over the backcountry are beginning to gather in defense. Hearing of the gathering of Patriot militia, Ferguson warned that the Patriot leaders needed to lay down their arms or he and his men would, and here's this incendiary language I was talking about, quote, lay waste to their country with fire and sword. The warning did not work, as Colonels John Sevier and Charles McDowell from the Western Carolinas joined up with William Campbell, colonel of the Virginia militia, and they met with a few more militia leaders, and they all together banded as a group and had a force of merely 1,400 men ready to take on Ferguson when the time is right. These men decided that William Campbell would be their de facto overall commander, but if they were to engage in any type of real fighting, they agreed they would act in council and really no one would lead the forces, which is pretty incredible when you think about that.
Actually, this is a pretty common thing with the colonials, is they all wanted to fight under their own commanders and stuff like that. And actually, if you even go back to the 7 Years' War, this was another issue that the British had, and the French actually had with the Indians and the French militia too. Anyway.
It's your local guy, right? And remember, people identify with their colony, not with the United States of America at this point.
It also shows the early signs of kind of what we would call, small d democratic formation, which is, Americans being like, no, this is stupid. I'm going to fight with my guys. I'm not going to fight with your guys.
Yeah. Oh, America.
We're going to do this our way, not your way. Your way's dumb.
Yeah. Yep, exactly. Because your way's dumb and our way is smart.
Yeah, yes. A little reductionist, but you can kind of make you can make that statement.
Yeah, I mean, it's a podcast. So. But
just a disclaimer, right?
Exactly,
not trying to be overly reductionist.
Like pretty much everything here. Ferguson had received word that this large military force or militia force had gathered and was heading his way. And so he decided that he was actually going to hightail it back towards Charlotte to rendezvous with Cornwallis and get the protection that he and his men needed. And as Ferguson inched closer to Cornwallis' Charlotte, the Patriot militia began to become even more focused on their opportunity to catch up to him. They'd also found out that instead of just continuing for one more day, right, retrospective's the best. Instead of just continuing for one more day to Charlotte, Ferguson decided to camp at King's Mountain with his 1,200 men. Kings Mountain is basically like a plateau with geography in the shape that would almost resemble a foot, with the heel being the highest point here. And this is where the Americans will attack first, on the heel. The Patriot militia took 900 men on horseback and booked it for Kings Mountain, wanting to catch both Ferguson's men by surprise and also keep them from making it to Cornwallis' camp in Charlotte. And they were successful. Arriving on October 7th after riding through the night, the Patriots likely realized that not only did Ferguson not enforce his camp at all, which he didn't, but he was really the only British soldier there. The rest of the men were all Tory militia. For about the next hour, Patriot soldiers worked their way up the hill towards Ferguson's men after catching them by total surprise. They fired from behind trees and rocks, remaining protected throughout the fighting. It was really, the geography was set up perfectly for the guerrilla-style tactics of the American militia. Ferguson rode back and forth, having his men mount bayonet charges down the hill, only to see the Patriot then just disperse and run away. And then the British would have to retreat back up to the high ground, and the Patriots would just reform behind the trees and the rocks once again, continuing to shoot uphill at the British. Ferguson was shot and killed during the fighting, and once the Loyalist militia saw their leader fall, it was the beginning of the end for them. As many of the Loyalists surrendered, though, American soldiers shouted, quote, "Give 'em Tarleton's quarter and give 'em the Buford's play," in revenge for the treatment of the American soldiers at the Battle of Waxhaw. In the end, though, they did take prisoners, over 700 of them. This was a huge boost to Patriot morale following the losses at Charleston, Camden, and Waxhaw from last episode. Following news of this defeat, Cornwallis was beyond furious, being forced to abandon his plans to move into North Carolina, and he could not believe that Ferguson's entire force had been wiped out.
So the defeat is pretty catastrophic for the British strategy of standing up Loyalist troops. The basic gist of this was, right, British regulars move in, push away any Patriot or Continental forces, stand up the Loyalists, and move on. But with such a large detachment being defeated and no British army anywhere nearby, right, it really puts a damper on any other Loyalists coming out and joining up if they're not directly attached to the British army. So this is going to put Cornwallis's invasion in North Carolina on hold. It also strengthens the partisans in South Carolina as they get this big morale boost, as well as they get some booty from all these captured Loyalist militia. And it gives Nathaniel Greene more time to reorganize and rebuild the Southern Army without having to worry about Cornwallis snapping at his heels. So as a little aside about the partisan victory here, there was something called Sumner Law, which was basically, to our Carolina Gamecock partisan leader in the South, it was soldiers or militiamen who fought for him were rewarded with booty from the Loyalists that were either killed or captured. So again, we might have this romantic view of, the patriot fighting the good fight against the big bad army. But as I said, the Southern theater had kind of turned into this tit for tat killing. Well, it was also tit for tat stealing, right? Hey, nothing. If I'm going to fight for freedom, I might as well get a little money while I do it. So anyways, these hit and run.
In the end, it's all about that money.
Well, if you're going to put your life online, and
exactly, man.
For the record, this is something that has always happened in war.
That's right? What I'm saying. These are humans here. It's all about the booty.
If you ever if you ever read any really good history book about what happens when armies move through area, like looting and stealing is always going to happen. So
and the looting and the stealing are like the PG
version of
things.
it. Yeah. Not that it's
PG
a good
version.
thing. Like, don't get me wrong. Just because this happens doesn't mean you then yada yada it away. It's not a good thing, but it's a reality.
I like the Seinfeld reference.
Yeah. Well, yeah, not to get into the morals or ethics of this, but
yeah.
Anyways, back to the topic at hand. All right, so because of these hit and run tactics, Cornwallis is spread very thin, there's also this ever increasing flood of what we would kind of consider refugees. So loyalists, hearing of this defeat, want to stick close to the British Army or British detachments. So if basically Cornwallis reorganizes where anybody is, a bunch of refugees are going to follow them. And then, these are true loyalists. So then, the crown feels obligated to take care of them. Well, that's more food. That's more money. That's more, shelter, tents, livestock. It's just more of a hassle to take care of. Like, where do you put all these people if they all keep showing up in Charleston? There isn't enough houses. So
and not only that, in fact, not only do they travel with them and then they have to house them, they have to feed them, they have to potentially clothe them and take care of them medically, whatever it is, but it also totally undermines the entire strategy of the South if the refugees are traveling with the army. And this sort of gets to something that I've read about from quite a few different historians, this idea of the, quote, front behind the front. And what would that be in the Southern Theater Act, the front behind the front?
So basically that's the supply lines and the detachments that the British have basically put out. So yeah, they're in Charleston and Savannah, but they're all since they want to stand up the loyalists, they're sending out detachment of troops to small towns. Okay, these detachment of troops now need to have food. Now you have to have patrols. The patrols are vulnerable to attack. So what this does is it puts a big strain on the British Army, which is they naturally have to diffuse their force across a wider geography to try to to protect the loyalists in the area. And as they diffuse their force, they spread it thin. It allows the Patriots, the Continentals, the partisans to basically move and strike at their location of choosing. So while the British might have a larger army compared to what we would consider guerrillas today, the guerrillas can concentrate at weak points where they would then have the tactical advantage and the element of surprise for victory to basically overwhelm these small detachments. And as this goes on, it puts a strain on the British forces because, all right, if I'm going to lose 50 guys here, 20 guys there, okay, well, now I need to shrink my area of operations. And as you shrink your area of operations, you give up more of the population. The loyalists have to retreat back. And it puts more strain on the supply chain and et cetera. So, the more compact you are as the British, the more secure you are, but yet you've now given up the population in the area of operations. Yeah. So it's this tit for tat. And
you're basically undermining your own strategy by doing that.
Yeah. And you could say this is something that the United States experienced in Vietnam or maybe in the Iraq War.
Or like right now. Yeah. And has for a long time. Yes,
so,
absolutely.
So that's what a lot of modern historians look at this as basically kind of what we would call today an insurgency and why it's successsive. So, anyways.
Very good. So no, that was great. But so getting back on the narrative, so Kings Mountain. So this is the battle I alluded.
If I could just say one thing,
Sure.
I would say the British aren't completely clueless, as they've dealt with rebellions in the past in Ireland or Scotland. But one of the big differences is just the geography. Right, the Americas is just so much bigger than the Highlands in Scotland or Ireland, and the British strategy in those was typically to basically burn people's houses and kick them out. And so them mirroring those tactics here to less success is actually kind of interesting.
Yeah. And I mean, it goes right back to that question I asked you, the front behind the front, because usually in European warfare, you take a city, you take a major area, then you leave people who are allied with you or who are your troops to maintain it and run it, and then you continue to march on forward. And as you take areas, those areas then belong to you. Yeah. And one thing that the British began to find out the hard way is that they would take an area, they would then leave loyalists to protect it, quote unquote, and then they would continue to march on, and then those areas would flip back to the Patriots because the loyalists either weren't real sincere in their desire to hold it, or they were forced into, out of fear or force itself, to turn the area over. So it's like you're doing all of this, and remember, the British have a limited number of men. They are going heavily into debt throughout this war, so they don't have the ability to resupply men, ammunition, food, clothing, etc. that the Americans do, because they're in the United States of America. So the Americans have an enormous advantage in that way too, and we'll see this come to play out more as we get further into this episode, talking about how things begin to unravel for the British.
Yes.
But in the end, Kings Mountain is a battle that's often overlooked in the Revolution. It is the one where the militia won the entire battle without a commander. Pretty incredible stuff. But when it's studied closely, it's obvious the impact it had, an impact that Zach and I just finished speaking about. Teddy Roosevelt actually said that this brilliant victory marked the turning point of the American Revolution. Thomas Jefferson said, quote, "the turn of the tide of success," when referring to the Battle of Kings Mountain. And former President Herbert Hoover said, quote, "history has done scant justice to its significance, which should place it behind Lexington, Bunker Hill, Trenton, and Yorktown." Now, whether you agree with Roosevelt, Jefferson, or Hoover just on how important Kings Mountain was, needless to say, if you weren't aware of the Battle of Kings Mountain at this point, you should become aware of it, because it was a critically important battle in turning the momentum of the war in the South. And like all the battles we talk about, I'll be sure to be posting maps on Facebook and on Twitter for these battles, so you can go and check them out. That fall, shortly after the victory at Kings Mountain, the next commander of the Southern Army, Nathaniel Greene, arrived to assess the situation. Interestingly enough, Nathaniel Greene was a Quaker. The people who, were pacifists and believed in nonviolence, but apparently he didn't really buy into that aspect of the dogma too much. Greene had his work cut out for him, but he was the one that should have been chosen in the first place. Remember, Greene was Washington's first choice when they sent Gates down instead. And he's been languishing away as the quartermaster general, basically in charge of supply lines and logistics, when he was a serious battlefield talent. So it's great for the Americans that Greene is back in the fray. But when he had to take control of the army in the Carolinas, there really wasn't much of an army to begin with. And he had to figure out how he was going to be successful. Where men like Benjamin Lincoln, Horatio Gates, were not successful at all. One thing that Nathaniel Greene did have, though, Daniel Morgan. The Daniel Morgan. Arriving in early December, Nathaniel Greene was pleased to see Morgan. Having experience in the French and Indian War, the Siege of Boston, the invasion of Canada, and the Battle of Saratoga, the great wagoner Daniel Morgan was not only experienced, but he was brave, tough, trustworthy, and a brilliant military mind. Greene, who was Washington's first choice when Congress had chosen Gates, like I mentioned a moment ago, decided that he was going to have an unorthodox approach to this war. He was going to split up his men and put about 1,000 of his men under the command of Daniel Morgan. And Zach, I'd just like to ask you to chime in just for a minute here, because, usually it's very unorthodox. It flies against military tactics to split up your army in battle, because the idea is if you split up your army, you could be defeated in a frontal assault. But Greene knew that this is what he needed to do and maybe had to do in order to win in the South, which, like I said, was flying in the face of military logic. Why did Greene decide to do this?
Well, the big part of it is even concentrated, Greene was really no match for Cornwallis if Cornwallis was concentrated as well. So by splitting his forces, he again, causes Cornwallis to have to split his forces again. And at with smaller engagements, the Patriots have a better chance of winning than larger engagements. Because now Cornwallis doesn't know which direction to go. Hey, there's troops to the north, there's maybe troops to the west, maybe there's troops to the northeast. Which direction should I direct my limited resources? Because if he goes, let's say, to the west, then it exposes the northern flank, and he risks being encircled or having his supply lines attacked. And as we've talked over and over again, there aren't grocery stores where you just grab stuff from. Having bases of supplies is really important, and a big part of being an officer in the 18th century is just keeping your troops moving and keeping them well fed and well supplied. So there's always a risk that if you expose your flanks, you're exposing your supply base, and you could get lost in the country, and the next thing you know, you're out of food and men are starving and dropping out, and then you become really weak and really prone to being attacked.
And I think and real quick, Zach, I just want to hop in because I think this is a really important point to hone in on, because what we'll talk about in a few minutes here is that Cornwallis will really, following the Battle of Cowpens, really speed up his advance toward Morgan and Greene and drop a lot of his supplies. And I think it was like a year or two ago, you and I were talking, and you likened this idea of 18th century logistics to like going to the beach. Do you remember that analogy you made? I thought it was a great one.
Yeah, like if you were just going to go to the beach with some friends, right?
All day beach trip.
Right? Just think of how much stuff you're going to bring, right? You got to bring your towels, a change of clothes. You're going to bring a cooler with drinks. You're going to bring a cooler with food. You're going to bring towels. You're going to bring like,
stuff like
stuff like that.
bodyboards.
There's just all this stuff that you're going to bring.
Yeah.
If there's just 5 of you.
Yeah, you fill the entire car up for one day at the beach.
The entire car is basically filled with enough of stuff just for you to do like 4 hours of activity for one day.
Yeah.
And there's places you can stop to pick up anything that you've kind of forgotten or need. And, and that's with modern convenience and whatnot. And it's just a huge logistical challenge just to do that. And anyone who's a parent knows, like, if you have a couple of kids, just getting the kids moving is like a nightmare. And like all the stuff you have to bring.
Yes.
And the way it scales, like as soon as you have like 1,000 people you have to feed, 3 times a day, and you have to, make sure, they got to have shoes. You got to keep them moving. You got to have all these horses. The horses all need to be fed. Right? There needs to be fodder for all this stuff. Oh, by the way, you have to carry all your ammunition with you so you can actually fight when you do run into people.
Yeah. Their wives and families, refugees who come with them.
So then there's all the camp followers who come along, and it expands. And I mean, the sheer, so this is another concept here, which is when you're moving, you actually want to your forces at this time, you want to have them diffuse, because the supply, the strain of supply is then way lower. It's easier to get supplies from local vendors or villages, because a village of like 100 people, they don't have enough food to support, 2,000 troops who come in and stay there for, months. They'll be eaten, in the poorhouse and will starve during winter. So the more diffuse the army is, the easier it is to move. The
more they spread out.
Yeah, basically. The more they've spread out, the easier it is for them to supply and move. However, if they run into people, they're very easily defeated. So it's this thing of, how do I keep my army spread out but able to concentrate and get all together to fight the big battle?
Yeah.
And that's a constant strain of 18th century and early 19th century warfare.
Well, I appreciate you bringing in that analogy. I remember when you mentioned that to me. It was probably like a year or two ago, and that stuck with me because I remember.
Well, yeah, because you were teaching in Maryland, and everybody goes to the beach, like in Maryland, and you have to bring a bunch of crap with you to have a good time.
Yeah, and I remember it just really stuck with me when you said that, because I have a lifetime of headaches of packing for the beach. As a child and watching my parents do it, now that I have children. I pack them for the beach, and it is, it is so much stuff.
There's so much stuff, Eber. Yeah, like when I go climbing, it is like every time, all right, not to be like All right, this is besides the point, but every time we go to the crag, right, you have to bring like your rope, crash pads, seats, food, water, all this, guidebook, all this stuff. You bring so much stuff.
Yeah.
It's such a pain in the butt. You're like, I just want to go climbing.
Crag. Sounds like, what was that? American Gladiator? What was the Nickelodeon show?
That was Guts.
Guts. Yeah, that's it. Guts. Oh, great. You're just like them. Okay. So anyway, diving back into it. So at this point, and we got off into the segue when we started talking about, and we talked about logistics and everything else quite a bit, but which was great. I'm glad we did, but we started here when I mentioned to you, Zach, like, why did Greene split his forces, right? And he did that to make it far more difficult for Cornwallis. He couldn't leave Charleston or Fabian unprotected. He then had to split his forces. So when Nathaniel Greene sent Daniel Morgan west to recruit some Patriot militia and raise morale, Cornwallis, who had delayed his march into North Carolina following the defeat at Kings Mountain, was incredibly annoyed at Morgan and his men in the west, knowing that he could not, like we mentioned, head north or else he'd be exposed on the left to Morgan's men. So he probably thought, not a big deal, I'll just send Bannister after them. And on January 2nd, he did just that, ordering Bannister Tarleton to get rid of Morgan for him. And it made sense. While Tarleton was only 26 years old, the dude was making quite a name for himself. He's the one who captured General Lee earlier in the war. He was pivotal in the victories at Camden and Charleston, and he led forces at the victory at Waxhaw. Cornwallis likely believed it would be just a matter of time until he received word of Tarleton's victory over Morgan, and Cornwallis began to march behind Tarleton to crush any ragtag remnants of Morgan's army after Tarleton took him in battle. And that brings us to the next major conflict, the Battle of Cowpens. Because these two men, Morgan and Tarleton, did decide to meet in battle at a place that didn't seem to benefit Morgan and the American forces very much. The two men met at an open field known as Hannah's Cowpens, with Tarleton having about 1,100 troops supporting his efforts, and Morgan somewhere between like 1,800 and 1,900, but then other historians say it was closer to 1,000, but the commonly accepted number is around 1,900. So a little less than 2-to-1 advantage for the Americans. Tarleton, though, had woken up his men at 2 a.m. and force-marched them to Cowpens to meet Morgan. His men were already exhausted and hungry, so this was likely not the best decision. And author Lawrence Babbage noted in his book The Devil of a Whipping, The Battle of Cowpens, which we mentioned at the beginning of the episode, said that, quote, in the 5 days prior to the battle, the British were subjected to stress that could only be alleviated by rest and proper diet. He also continued on that the British had run out of food 2 days earlier and were only operating on about 4 hours of sleep. On top of this, Tarleton knew that a large portion of Morgan's men were made up of militia, and he was anxious to begin the battle, a militia that Morgan also knew was raw, untrained, and likely would be easily intimidated. Knowing what had happened to Gates at Camden, Morgan wanted to make sure that even if things went south here at the Battle of Cowpens, these men didn't abandon him like the Virginia and North Carolina militias did to Gates at Camden. So he placed his army in between two rivers just in case. With streams on the right and left side, Morgan reasoned that Tarleton wouldn't try to outflank him early in the battle and would likely attack him from the front, just like an overconfident British officer would in the face of an untrained militia force. And Morgan set up the battle to ensure that Tarleton would do just that. Now you might be wondering, why would this be a bad setup for the Americans? Well, it's on a wide open field, and Tarleton's specialty, his most valuable forces were his cavalry. So if you're fighting on a wide open field like this, the assumption is the cavalry is going to be able to outflank you. But Morgan, like I said, figured that Tarleton would save his cavalry till the end. Morgan prepared a pretty brilliant battle strategy. He broke his men up into 3 lines, with his weakest men in the front and strongest in the back. So follow with me here. He had 3 lines of men. His weakest were in the front, about 150 sharpshooters from North Carolina and Georgia in the front. The second line had about 300 militiamen, and the third line were the rest of his men, the Continental soldiers, which included great fighters from Delaware and Maryland who had fought as early in the war as the Battle of Brooklyn. All of these men were in the back. So 3 lines. You have sharpshooters in the front, about 150, 300 militiamen in the middle, and the rest in the back. And behind them were William Washington, George's third cousin. He was leading the American cavalry, and they were hidden behind that third line. Each line basically hiding the line behind them. Ideally, in Morgan's mind, Tarleton and his men would attack the skirmishers. They would fire a volley, and then the skirmishers would fall back, convincing the British that they were retreating and baiting them into continuing forward with their advance, which would likely become more organized by the steppe. After this, they would come face to face with the militiamen, the second line, who would be asked to fire 2 volleys and then fall back themselves. At this point, the British would be sure to believe that this definitely was a retreat. After this, the British would be face to face with the rest of the men, including the strong fighting Continental forces. Morgan was banking on the fact that the British would be exhausted from their strategy and that they would not have the energy or the willpower to face a third line effectively. And the plan worked perfectly. A few minutes before the sun came up, Tarleton's men began to emerge from the woods, and Bannister pushed them directly into battle. When the first American line, the skirmishers, began to retreat just like they were told, Tarleton, just like predicted, pushed his men forward. He was so excited to fight this battle, and he pushed his men forward so quickly that the rest of his forces, including his cavalry, hadn't even had the opportunity to get out of the woods and onto the battlefield yet. So part of his army is fighting the battle and advancing forward, and the other part is still in the woods when the battle began. As the first line retreated, Tarleton's men pressed forward and ran directly into the second line, the 300 militia. These militia took specific aim at the officers, greatly confusing the men. Heck, about 40% of the British casualties in this battle were officers. The militia, after firing their 2 shots, then retreated, and follow me here, they retreated around the American left flank, and the British pressed forward, tasting victory. But as the British advanced forward, they were shocked to see another line of men. What the hell? Just as everything looked like it was going against the British, though, the right flank of the American lines misunderstood directions and began to withdraw. This caused British soldiers on their left to break rank and charge. But at the perfect time, Morgan was able to get his men to turn an about face, fire another volley, shocking the British and confusing them even further. This actually was an accident, turned out to work out really well. So picture this. The British are rushing forward on the third line. On the British left, their men have basically broken off from formation to charge those Americans who were withdrawing. The Americans on the American right turn and fire a volley. While this is happening, Morgan sends the men on the American center to charge forward with the bayonet charge. While they're charging forward, the American cavalry is swooping around on the American left. Washington and his cavalry are swooping around on the American left. And that second line, that militia, remember the ones that retreated around the left side of the American lines? They did an entire loop-de-loop, 360, and they wrapped all the way around, and they came on the right flank. So the second line militia have gone all the way around to attack on the right flank. The forces in the center are pushing forward, and the cavalry's coming along the left. As this was happening, stuff hit the fan for Tarleton and the British. They were shocked. They had men, in the face of these overwhelming developments here, Tarleton's men literally began to surrender on the spot. They had men fall to the ground and literally just give up in the middle of battle. Something that Babbitt's reasoned likely was combat shock. And when this happened, the battle was over. The combination of exhaustion, hunger, and demoralization was too much for the British, and it caught up to them all at once. As Tarleton and his men began to retreat, William Washington cried out, quote, "Where is now the boasting Tarleton?" The impact of the battle was huge for the Americans, the British losing over 700 prisoners, 200 wounded. Tarleton's entire army was basically destroyed, and this was the cream of the crop of Cornwallis's forces. One British major complained that his great fighting men were put, quote, "under that boy to be sacrificed." A clear indictment of Tarleton and his performance on the battlefield. John Buchanan, in his book, The Road to Guilford Courthouse, The American Revolution in the Carolinas, which I also mentioned at the beginning of this episode, stated that when Tarleton reached Cornwallis to tell him of his failure, Cornwallis was so angry, he placed his sword tip into the ground and pressed on it so hard the blade snapped. It seems as though Tarleton was far too focused on pursuing Morgan and defeating his army, and that he did not take the time to properly prepare, rest, plan, or consider any potential drawbacks to this battle. This victory, coupled with Kings Mountain, pretty much crushed any opportunity for Cornwallis to hold South Carolina, and was the first major event that led to the ultimate surrender of the British forces just 10 months later at Yorktown. Cornwallis continued forward, because the idea was that he was going to, remember, scoop up the remnants of Morgan's army. Well, it didn't quite work out that way, but Cornwallis was on his heels. As Tarleton was embarrassing himself at Cowpens, Nathaniel Greene was content. He wasn't 100% sure that Morgan would be able to pull out the victory over Tarleton, but he did know that Cornwallis was playing into his hands. In what became nicknamed, quote, the Race to the Dan, which is the Dam River, Cornwallis pursued Greene's forces and Morgan's forces as quickly as he could. The Dam River is right along the border between North Carolina and Virginia, and Cornwallis wanted to get to Greene and Morgan before Morgan either had the opportunity to join him and before either men had the opportunity to cross the Dam River. But Cornwallis was taking a while because, like we mentioned, the people in the Carolinas really weren't big fans of the British occupation, and they weren't sharing a lot of information, and they weren't sharing a lot of food or supplies. Greene knew that he would not be in a favorable matchup with Cornwallis if he were to meet him in open battle, so he purposefully avoided him as much as he possibly could, fighting small skirmishes and using hit-and-run tactics, infuriating Cornwallis more and more. As Cornwallis began to chase Morgan, he realized Morgan was moving too quick. So he abandoned much of his supplies and baggage to speed up, greatly overstretching his supply lines and making his life a logistical nightmare, a decision that actually caused 250 Hessians to quit on the spot. When Greene found out that Cornwallis was doing exactly as he had hoped he would, he said, quote, "Then he is ours." Fighting Cornwallis over a dozen times and losing almost every engagement, Greene was relentless. He famously described his life in the Carolinas as, quote, "We fight, get beat, rise, and fight again." These Fabian tactics were reminiscent of Quintus Fabius, a Roman dictator who fought Hannibal in the Second Punic War.
So this is after, for anyone who knows anything about Roman history, there's the Second Punic War between Carthage and Rome. Hannibal, the general of the Carthaginians, has just scored his greatest victory over the Romans, defeating a superior army at the Battle of Cannae on the Italian peninsula.
Which, by the
Rome
way,
herself,
was a double envelopment that was very similar to the Battle of Cowpens.
Yes, at a much grander scale.
Yeah, and it was way sweeter and better because Hannibal was the man.
And this victory has left Rome bare for conquest. Yet Hannibal does not attack Rome, in part because of this man Fabian, who basically leads a partisan movement up and down the boot of Italy, basically convincing Hannibal that there's one last Roman field army he has to defeat. And Hannibal marches up and down the boot of Italy, pursuing Fabian. And the whole while, Rome is able to reconstitute herself and get an army and actually send it to attack Carthage to force Hannibal to withdraw from the Italian peninsula.
Yeah, and the whole time Fabius did this, I mean, he took so much flack from the Senate, too, because they all wanted him to fight, right? They were very proud Romans.
Good Roman virtue is not for hit-and-run tactics.
Exactly,
it's for open
right?
battle.
But Nathaniel Greene quite literally copied a page directly out of Quintus Fabius's book. And he knew, just like Fabius knew about Hannibal, that if he fought him in open battle, he would likely lose. Greene knew that if he fought Cornwallis in open battle, at least at that time, he would likely lose, and that if he just forced Cornwallis to chase him throughout the countryside, eventually his supplies will be exhausted, his men will be exhausted, and he will be extremely frustrated and likely make a mistake. All the while, the Americans were continuing to be resupplied and recruiting more men to fight on his behalf. Eventually, Greene was able to make it across the Dam River and feed and resupply his troops while they called up on rest. Cornwallis, finding out he made it across the river, was despondent. He just missed the last boats to cross the river, and now he was stuck. He sent his exhausted men south to forage for food, and sent Loyalist Dr. John Pyle to gather men for Loyalist militia. Unfortunately for Pyle, Greene had sent Henry Lee and Andrew Pickens south to do some recon, and they, along with about 600 militia, ran into Pyle and his men. Pyle, this is embarrassing, unknowingly mistook them for British officers, expecting Bannister Tarleton to arrive shortly, and the Americans were able to surprise them in their attack. Pyle lost 93 men with 250 wounded, while the Americans had 1 prisoner killed. And 1 horse. That's it. Known as Pyle's Massacre, Cornwallis lamented to Lord Germain that most of Pyle's forces were, quote, inhumanly butchered when begging for quarters without making the least resistance. Having fed, supplied, and rested his men, Greene decided it was time to cross back to the south side of the Dan and meet Cornwallis in battle once and for all. And that brings us to the last conflict we'll talk about on this episode, the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. Finding out that Nathaniel Greene had about 4,000 men camped at Guilford Courthouse, Cornwallis decided to make his move, a bold decision considering he only had about 2,000 men himself. With the Battle of Cowpens happening on January 17th, it is now the middle of March, March 15th, just 2 months later. And Greene decided to take a page out of Morgan's book. Morgan had actually since retired from the army at this point. He was exhausted and he was sick. But Greene took a page out of his book, and he lined up his men in 3 different lines, with the North Carolina militia in the first line, Virginia militia in the second line, and the Continental forces in the third line, including, once again, the men from Delaware and Maryland. While resembling the formation that Morgan used at Cowpens, it is important to note that these lines were much further apart from each other. Greene wasn't quite the tactician Morgan was. They were about 350 yards apart, as opposed to Morgan's men, which were only about 150. Because of this, they were not able to actively support each other during the battle, and it wasn't quite as effective, as we will see. As the British began forward toward the first line, they halted. Something didn't look good. See, there was a wooden fence along the first line of defense for the Americans, which meant that these Americans could rest their rifles on the fence, greatly improving their accuracy. The men from North Carolina had, quote, their arms presented and resting on the picket fence. They were taking aim with knife precision. The first line shot once and fled, but did significant damage, with one British officer stating that, quote, 1/2 of the Highlanders dropped on that spot. The British, although suffering heavy casualties, fought through the first line and the second line and on to the third, bravely meeting the Americans in battle, although severely outnumbered. After heavy fighting, the American forces retreated, Greene's favorite tactic. The battle lasted only an hour and a half, and technically, the British won. But the British lost over a quarter of their men in the process. Once again, Greene's tactics worked. Another victory for the British, but a victory that left them in worse shape than prior to the battle. Seeing this as a classic Pyrrhic victory, a war critic in Britain exclaimed that, quote, another such victory would ruin the British army. Cornwallis was incredibly proud of his men, even though in the big picture things were not looking good for him. And this was a great decision by Greene to fight. He really had nothing to lose. He had twice as many men. The worst thing that could happen is what happened here, a small loss in which he was able to retreat, get away safely, and Cornwallis would lose hundreds of men in the process. The American forces suffered about 90 killed and 185 wounded. The British had about the same dead, but twice as many men wounded. Cornwallis reported back to London that, quote, the conduct and actions of the officers and soldiers that compose this little army will do more justice to their merit than I can by words. Their persevering intrepidity in action, their invincible patience in the hardships and fatigues of a march of above 600 miles, in which they would have forded several large rivers and numberless creeks, many of which would be reckoned large rivers in any other country in the world, without tents or coverings against the climate, and often without provisions, will sufficiently manifest their ardent zeal for the honor and interest of their sovereign and their country. Zach, is there anything you wanted to add here before I sign off?
The big thing to draw is that Greene and Morgan had landed on a very effective tactics to fight the British. So the British, after several years of basically seeing Americans, the Continentals basically line up in European formation, had gotten used to, if we just attack them with European tactics, they'll withdraw, we'll take the field and win the day. And what Morgan and Greene figured out was, our weakness, which is we don't have a lot of regulars, we have a lot of militia who will break ranks, is that we will deploy them in a configuration that we would call defense in depth. So that's the multiple lines that Chris talked about. And while they would still lose the field, they were inflicting damage on the British Army that was hard for the British Army to recover from. So that was the key insight that Greene and Morgan had, was how do we best use the available forces we have, and how does this advance our strategy? And their basic strategy is keep our army in the field and keep the costs of the British army high. And that's Greene's quote. We wake up, we fight, we lose, we do it again the next day.
Yeah, and it was really effective. And it was effective to the point that Cornwallis will give up on this entire escapade in the Carolinas.
Yep, he'll basically go, okay, well, Virginia is where they're getting all their supplies from. I'm going to go to Virginia and just try to take all their supplies so I don't have to deal with this nonsense in Carolina anymore.
And I'll talk about this more next episode. It will be just me on the next episode, but this is where Cornwallis had been begging Clinton to go to Virginia, and he hadn't done it. So Cornwallis felt like he had to do it on his own. But I digress, because that's for next week. As you pack up your things, I'd like you to consider just how things have changed in this war. The beginning of the Southern campaign, what we talked about on the last episode, saw the Americans losing Savannah, Charleston, Gates running away 180 miles after the Battle of Camden, and the massacre at Waxhaw. But they responded in the action, as we spoke about today, with huge victories at Kings Mountain, Cowpens, another successful engagement at Guilford Courthouse, and the constant, incessant bothering of the British Army from American militias. While Cornwallis doesn't realize it at this point, he certainly feels like he owns Georgia and the Carolinas, right? Because the Americans have retreated north, and he will soon look to head north, looking for a spot along the coast in Virginia, because in the end, his situation was just untenable. When he does this, he will just continue to play into the hands of the Americans and seal both his fate and the fate of the British Empire at the Battle of Yorktown, which we'll cover next week on episode 69. Zach, thanks for joining me for 2 weeks in a row. Looking forward to doing the Patreon Q&A with you here in a couple weeks. I'll let everyone know when that's up. Thanks for listening, and hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed. I'd like to give a specific shout out to the Patreon supporters on the History Nerd level: Norm McLaughlin, Lene Benson, Brett Murphy, and Mary Kandaris. Thanks for all your support. It means a ton, and it helps us to put out this podcast every single week. See you next week.